We're back. We're live. We're here live with Mexico City with Carlos Juarez of HPU, who joins us by Skype from Mexico City. Hi, Carlos.
Aloha, Jay, and our listeners. So great to connect with you here, and look forward to a chat, a chance to share some insights from this part of the world.
Yes, you're our global traveler on Global Connection, and we're therefore calling this show Catching Up with Carlos.
Oh,
We might, name other shows using the same name. Before we start, I just want to tell our listeners that they can tweet us. They can tweet questions and comments. Use ThinkTech High, ThinkTech HI. Okay, so Carlos, it's great to talk to you. The last time we spoke, I think, were you here or were you?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
there actually just last week with Patrick Bratton.
That's
but
right.
Before that, in Austria, as you know,
Austria.
I spent the spring semester in Europe.
And so now you're in Mexico City. I guess that's a family matter, but there you are, and you're kind enough to talk to us while you're there.
Yes, I'm visiting some family here and also in Texas, San Antonio, where I have family. And in many ways, Mexico is so deeply connected to the U.S., important trade partner, obviously the migration, we can speak to some of those issues. But it's a country that has always been important and will continue to be. And so it's important for us, all of us, even in remote Hawaii, we need to understand this relationship and what implications it might have, even for Hawaii.
Yeah, it seems like more and more. Let's talk about U.S.-Mexican relations for a moment. It seems like, the interdependence between the U.S. and Mexico has never been greater. There's a lot of collaboration and business going on. There's a lot of exchange. You read in the paper about all the migration issues. We can talk about that later. But the general drift here, the sea change, is that the U.S. and Mexico are tight like brothers. Am I right?
Well, it's certainly very complex interdependence. They have, I could say on one hand that the relations are very strong and vital. I mean, they have moments, and today, as we speak, there's a very tense, situation because a few weeks ago, the number one criminal who was behind bars in a maximum security prison escaped, and El Chapo Guzman, as he's known, one of the drug lords, and so it's caused a real bit of a sore because the U.S. had been asking to have him extradited so the U.S. could put him in a real maximum security prison. Well, that caused a source of embarrassment. But more generally, the relationship is one that is defined really by the geography. We have two countries that share a 2,000-mile border, and nowhere else in the world do you see a border that long between countries at a pretty high difference of development. The U.S., a first world country. Mexico, parts of it are certainly very well developed, but it remains really a country with a lot of development challenges. And so the bilateral relations, they affect millions of people on both sides. And it is, of course, trade and economic relations that are probably the single most, but you have education exchange, you have drug control issues, of course, entrepreneurship and things like the environment. The border is a very, very bustling area of industrial development, and a lot of that means that the waste finds its way going up north. And as any surfer in San Diego will tell you, they know the days when that sewage makes its way up the coastline. And so the environmental issues are going to be also continue to be very critical to address. So the scope of the relationship is very broad and very complex. And particularly in trade, it's just huge. The amount of trade is massive. I'll cite some numbers in just a moment, but suffice it to say it's the second largest trading partner, and actually third after Canada after Canada and China. But it is the largest source for the U.S. of many of our goods, winter crops and many other manufactured goods, washing machines, televisions. We get them all right from the border. So
yeah,
very important.
Now you alluded to an area just south of the border where factories were being developed. Yeah. I know that labor is cheaper in Mexico, so it's to the interest of an American company to set up a factory there, or a European company for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some Japanese. Most are American, but actually Japanese manufacturers have a fair number. Samsung and many of the other from Japan. These are what they call maquiladoras. They're sort of in-bond industries, and they've been exploding in the last 20, 25 years. The North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed in 1993, about 20 years now, 22 years, between Mexico and the U.S. helped to stimulate more of this, and it's a huge influx of investment money, factories on the border that are set up to take advantage of cheap labor. Now, others are critical and say, well, they also take advantage of weak environmental laws, weak labor laws, and so it's a very controversial issue. even for Mexico. It's a big source of revenue and money, but it also pulls people away from other parts and leaves, the provincial areas they come from are kind of left empty. So this issue of the industry along the border, important, complex, controversial, and yet, again, huge in terms of the scale and the scope.
Well, it does suggest that Mexico's economy would be tracking on the U.S. economy too, and that Mexico's economy, because of all this trade and manufacturing, would be in pretty good shape. Is it?
Well, again, these always depends on where you sit or who you ask, but in terms of just raw data, yes, the numbers are just astonishing. I mean, I can, mention some figures of, well, today, 80% of Mexico's exports come to the U.S., and just looking real quickly here, U.S. companies, for example, direct investment, about $100 billion. You've got even Mexican companies today, and that's part of the other story, that Mexico is now a leading investor into the U.S., almost $18 billion coming this last year alone. It's grown in the last 5 years 35%. You have a lot of wealthy Mexicans, industrialists, who are now turning to invest in our economy. But again, more generally, the two-way trade, a figure that is quite astonishing to me, the last figure in 2013, $550 billion in two-way trade. I mean, the numbers are just astonishing. Now, it's a mixed bag because, again, the winners are obviously maybe industrial areas, but there are many parts of Mexico less developed, underdeveloped, where NAFTA has probably, done more harm for them because, they don't get retrained and retooled, and they're sort of left. Especially the agricultural sector. The U.S. Agriculture is so powerful that it has really put out of business a lot of Mexican farmers, and so that's a very delicate issue as well.
Yeah. So what is the quality of life like? I mean, if I rev up my car in Texas, cross the border,
well,
am I going to
first
be able
I would
to
say
tell?
Don't do that. Come by plane, because as it turns out, the Mexico border with Texas, just below the Texas border, is a pretty dangerous area these days. A lot of the drug wars are kind of fighting there. Now, and that's a bit sad on the one hand, because 20, 25 years back, Mexico was not known for some of that violence. But having said that, I want to tell you, most people's lives here are pretty normal. They're not out, all being, gunned down or kidnapped. I mean, there is, of course, a certain level of criminality and injustice, no doubt. But what's always remarkable to me about this place, and this is true of a lot of developing countries, most people lead very, very, happy, good quality lives, even by indices of, relative, quality of life, quite good. Of course, when you talk about Mexico, the culture is so critical, the family is so important. And, what does Mexico contribute? Well, a lot of it is things even from the arts or in music or in food and cuisine. And, I mean, these are very popular in the U.S. I mean, any place you go now, I mean, what we're told now, salsa is more popular than ketchup and what have you. But here I just want to say, I think we often have a misperception in the U.S. that somehow everybody here is like, on edge and, living, I guess, not a good quality life. I have to tell you quite the opposite. It's a very good quality of life, a richness of culture and arts and cuisine. On the other hand, globalization, like everywhere else, has brought a lot of modernization and some, Starbucks everywhere, lots of connections to the U.S., and yet Mexico still retains the charm of being both new and old, of being a little bit unstable, but also very stable. And of course, being very rich, a lot of resources, a lot of wealth, but also very poor. There's a lot of, poverty and inequality. So it's a real paradox, a land of paradox, I would call it.
Well, interesting.
Yes.
Maybe we should rename the show Land of Parrot. No, I still like catching up with Carlos. But we have a Twitter question from
Yes.
Mark Ward. Mark asks, an interesting question. What is the general consensus of the Mexican people regarding the U.S., especially after the statements of the U.S. ambassador, U.S. embarrassment of Donald Trump?
Donald Trump, yes.
Yeah.
Well, of course, there's a lot of talk about him, and no doubt he's mobilized a lot of social media and protests. I think I would describe it as a love-hate relationship. On one hand, there's traditionally been a lot of anti-American sentiment and a lot of, the relationship between the two countries is very asymmetrical. The U.S. tends to be the big shot, gets what it wants, pushes its way around. In Mexico, I like to tell, especially with students, every Mexican here learns in the 5th grade that 1/3 of their land was given away in a treaty in 1848 that the U.S. signed with Mexico, basically forced. So, all of the Southwest, Texas, Nevada, California, New Mexico, Arizona, all of this became part of the U.S. from Mexico. Most Americans just assume it was always ours, and why, but you think for a moment, why is it Santa Fe, Los Angeles, San Antonio? These were part of Mexico, they were part of the old Spain, but the relationship is mixed. On the other hand, there's a lot of love and connection to the U.S., a lot of interest in, of course, American culture, especially popular culture, media, music, movies. Not only that, but I think the reality that so many Mexicans are connected to the U.S., either here living as immigrants or with family members that might be in the U.S. So there's a real deep connection between the two. And also I think people distinguish somewhat between maybe government policies and maybe something like Donald Trump, and he represents certainly an element of American society, and he's popular because he does, in fact, espouse rather controversial views that many people agree with, seal the border, this and that, and yet people can't help but shake their heads, and not always understanding our own political system. I mean, is this guy for real? Is he going to be the president? And, we debate that ourselves. On the one hand, he is like a bit of an entertainment show, but he is certainly shaking up our political system in interesting ways. But Mexicans obviously were very offended by what he had to say in his opening remarks, that all they do is send rapists and murderers and et cetera. Not quite. I mean, certainly there are some, there's no doubt. But the vast majority of Mexican immigrants who are coming are dynamic, entrepreneurial, hardworking, and frankly, our economy would not survive quite easily without them. So it is a dependence that we have on this flow of labor. And, it's easy to get, sensational headlines by saying things like that. The reality is a little bit more complicated. So a love-hate relationship, a lot of criticism, especially about our foreign policy. I mean, Mexico, like much of the developing world, tends to be critical of the U.S. and its role. And again, back to this history. They know a history of U.S. intervention. Marines have landed here in Veracruz and even intervened in different times to affect politics in previous years. So there's a certain, you just don't like that big neighbor that tends to be a bit of a bully sometimes. So there's a little animosity about that.
You talk about entertainment. It's ironic that we lose Jon Stewart and gain Donald Trump all
there you go.
same week.
Amazing.
Anyway, let's take a short break, Carlos. That's Carlos Juarez joins us by Skype from Mexico City. We're calling this Catching Up with Carlos here on Global Connections with the Global Traveler. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Jim Sean, and I'm host of a show called Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Each week, live streaming at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, we interview people who have special insights into education, from early education through K-12, all the way through higher education and beyond. Both public and private are areas we're interested in. We dig deeper. We try to find out what it's really like to be involved in making change, advocating for it, how you reform, what people's philosophies are in reforming it. As I said, we're live streaming every Wednesday at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii. And later on, you can find these interviews on YouTube and on the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. We hope you join us as many times as possible. Aloha.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here with Carlos Juarez, and he is in Mexico City, joining us by the miracle of Skype. And we're having a wonderful time catching up with Carlos in all his travels. So, I'm looking past you on the Skype video, and I see this beautiful garden in the back. Such color, such an interesting place. Can you talk about this home that you're in?
Yes, I mean, it's just almost surreal for me. I happen through close contact here, I'm actually staying at the home of a very well-known, renowned artist who's passed away, I think, in the 80s, but his name is Juan O'Gorman. Kind of ironic. Juan O'Gorman, good Irish name. He was the son of Irish immigrants. But in the early 20th century, he would become one of the leading muralists here in Mexico, a contemporary of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Here's one of his books that shows a typical picture of his. And he is, again, one of the big ones, if you will. This home of his is just really, I mean, it's an amazing, and actually you can rent it on Airbnb. I'm lucky that I have connections that allow me to stay here. But a beautiful home in one of the most beautiful parts of the city, Coyoacan. It's in the south, very historic colonial region and very artistic. And I think what it speaks to, of course, again, Mexico, the rich heritage that it has, we know it for the food on one hand, but it's a rich heritage, especially in the arts. Again, I mentioned Diego Rivera and his contemporaries. They did an amazing amount of murals here and even many parts of the U.S. You can visit, New York and San Francisco and even San Antonio. O'Gorman, the one from this house, has a beautiful mural in San Antonio as well. And these are huge, huge, huge art projects. So it's just a real charm to be here. And again, it speaks to the color, the vibrancy, and that reflects the culture of Mexico and draws on the indigenous past, which itself is a very rich heritage. And yet then you bring in these sort of European, sort of styles that combine to really make a rich, just a rich pattern of art history. And I'm just, amazed to be here. And as you see this garden place, it's like so beautiful, the setting.
Yeah, Mexican art has such a special signature, as you say. It's the indigenous influence and the European influence and bold colors and shapes.
Yes.
There's really nothing quite like it.
No, absolutely. And the other part, like even Miss O'Gorman and Diego Rivera, I mean, they also were speaking of really using their art to really tell stories and to speak to a lot of political issues. The government itself, would commission most of these artworks. So it's really remarkable. It's not, some of it is, of course, naturally just, traditional art of different kinds, but a lot of these big murals are really capturing the history and the social and cultural, context. And so that, I think, just makes it even more interesting because it's telling you a story.
Yeah, and there's a similarity between that and the food.
Yes,
it's
the
unique.
Food again. This is not Taco Bell food. Let me assure you. Even the most humble families, or the street food that you can get here, it's just so. I mean, the taste, the flavors, the spices, and again, Mexican food is really like the country itself, like the people. It is a mixture of the indigenous culture, very long history, and bringing in various Europeans. And while we know it's mostly the European, Spanish culture, of course, there's a lot of other culture, French, German, even some of the Asian countries have had an influence here in many ways. So it's a real just melting pot itself. And just the expressions in the food. I mean, Mexico is well known for some of that. If any of you maybe listeners recall a novel that became a famous movie, Like Water for Chocolate, a classic movie where every month there was a different recipe, and the recipe, I mean, it comes to life. The food itself reveals your emotions, and that's part of Mexico's psyche and culture. You don't just eat, you actually take on a whole nother dimension.
I have a member of my family who, but every year, he and his wife would go to Mexico in January for a food tour.
Yes. Oh, yes. And, I want to say Hawaii, I've lived so many years there now, and, we have some Mexican food there, but not the diversity and range that you can find in many parts of the U.S. now. One of the things, I've been in San Antonio recently, and there's been a large influx of Mexicans from Mexico in the last 10 years. And they've brought a lot of new restaurants that are really, traditional, different regional cuisine from Mexico, not the regular Tex-Mex that we know, that is, especially from Texas, more traditional, type. So it's nice to see that variety. And Hawaii, well, I think there's an opportunity there for it to eventually come because, Mexican food is, again, it's more complex than just these little crunchy tacos that we might get at a fast food place. A lot more diversity.
You're drawing a picture of a country that is similar to the U.S. in many ways, has a very nice quality of life, a quality of, physical life and intellectual life. And so, one of the things that I became aware of, perhaps, I'm not sure, and I want to ask you about it, is that with all this, these children immigrating across Mexico, from places south, then coming across Mexico, north into the U.S., and then looking for, a family or a place to live in the U.S. It suggests that the traditional desire of large numbers of Mexican people to cross the border, illegally or otherwise, is declining. And that in fact people from other parts of Central America, South America, are more interested these days. Am I right?
Well, that's true. Indeed, these young children you refer to, we saw them in the news maybe in the last year, huge numbers. Many of them are in fact coming from Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and partly those countries are much poorer than Mexico, a lot of underdevelopment, a lot of violence in even El Salvador these days. So that really pushes them, because when we think about immigration, we need to understand part of it is the push factor, the conditions back home in places like Mexico or Central America. People leave because they either are fear for their, personal safety, or they simply need better, options to feed their families. The other part, which is the pull factor, is our economy depends on labor that needs to come. So there's obviously incentives to pull them. But more generally, I would add to that too. We've spent, many years now, but certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of money has been put into tightening up the borders, more border patrols, some, more fences, if you will. And that has meant that, on one hand, it's a little more costly, more challenging to cross that border. It also means that many, especially undocumented migrants who might be in the U.S., are less likely to come back as quickly. It used to be easier, 15, 20 years ago to just do that back and forth. Now that it's not, it also means that many of those who might have gone back are actually stuck. And we have to understand that immigrants who come, you have some who are coming to just start a whole new life. They're called settlers. My father did that. He came from Mexico in the 50s, and it was to become, a new part of this country in the U.S. Many others, especially migrant workers who work in the agriculture sector, they don't have that plan. They want to come and work 6 to 9 months. They want to make money, but they want to go back. And, unfortunately, our system really is dysfunctional, doesn't work. In a more ideal world, we would have a formal guest worker program that would bring in temporary workers, give them, a decent salary and protection and things, but allow that flow, allow them to cross over, come back. And so instead, the result of not having that is they're on the margins. They live in, in sort of squatter settlements. They obviously have to, avoid any contact with the, authorities. And it also means the employers who need them have to sort of look the other way and be, essentially contributing to the illegal nature of all of that. But yes, it is changing a bit. The other is, the reality is that, again, for Mexico, and this is why we should have in the U.S. an interest in seeing Mexico get better, develop more. As the conditions get better here, as it would in any place, less likely to want to go. If you have good options here, if you have a good quality life, why would you want to leave? And it's not like people are excited to leave. I mean, there is a good quality life here, but the reality is that for some, it's maybe the conditions are just not good enough, or again, at the end of the day, you can make more money in one day's work than you might here for 2 weeks, and so it's just a no-brainer.
Right? It strikes me that there might be a time in the future when Mexico becomes so successful that that the U.S. Takes affirmative steps to encourage immigration.
That's true. And again, in certain areas, we have to do that. Places like India and other developing countries, we need their expertise. We need computer programmers. And Mexico actually does have, some expertise. There are doctors here, and I've got a cousin as a good example who's a certified surgeon and doctor, and he has opportunities in the U.S. that obviously will, give him more professional growth. And, there's just, we think of only the poor migrant workers that come from the field, and those are certainly one, but there are a lot of other very well-educated professionals, or just, creative artists, people who, frankly, our economy in the U.S. benefits from having that immigrant population. And one thing I always get angry about, I'm a child of immigrants myself, but this idea that the ones who come over are all these lazy Mexicans. You know what? The people who make that trek and cross over, they are hardworking, entrepreneurial. They are, they are what help keep our economy afloat. And that's the reality, not the idea that we heard from Donald Trump that they're all rapists and drugs. Well, again, there is that, but those are the exception.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's an issue though that has relevance to Hawaii,
yes.
And it's the issue of foreign investment.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that there was violence in some places and corruption, I guess.
Oh, yes. Lots of that.
So the question is, if I'm an American investor and I see this, this workforce that's being trained better all the time, that can staff factories, that can, that can help me in my company in any number of things, can I, should I, would I invest my money in Mexico? And if I try to do that, what are the challenges? What problems can I expect? Is there somebody going to be looking, for a bribe? Where does Mexico stand in terms of attracting, a broad-based foreign investment from the U.S.?
Well, again, part of our complex interdependence, it has been a very important part, and so the U.S. is a major investor. Again, the most recent figures I see, we have foreign direct investment by U.S. companies into Mexico is about $101 billion, the opportunities are there because both the labor force is cheaper, and so you can obviously produce products at that rate. But today, for example, the automobile industry, a huge number of our, transmissions and different parts of the cars are all manufactured here. The quality of the workforce is very high and has gotten much better over the years. Even today, I had a chance to see a great video a while ago, a factory in Mexico that produces the guacamole, the avocado puree that we buy, and you can go now to Costco or Safeway and buy. And these are plants here in Mexico, extremely modern. It looks like something right out of Breaking Bad, the meth labs that they set up, so clean and sterile. And I think, Mexico is certainly itself as a country, and the government is trying to foster that. They benefit from that investment. Probably the biggest news that's come now in the last year, actually just this past month, Mexico, for the first time since 1938, has now begun to open up its oil market for exploration and refining. It has been nationalized since 1938. Used to be the British, the Dutch, the Norwegians, and the Americans who did all the initial oil work, and today they are now opening that sector, which is quite significant for Mexico. It's still early, and that it didn't go as well as they had hoped, but I want to say that, companies certainly look to Mexico because it offers also the resources, natural resources, but especially the labor markets. Now, are there challenges? Yes. I mean, you have a certain level of corruption, no doubt, and you have inefficiencies. Just the public sector here, government regulations are very, not as easily enforced. So you have challenges there, and that requires you to have people who understand how things work here. You need a mixture of sort of, local managers who know the way, on the other hand, I would also say Mexico is it's a divided country. I would say the top third of the country, the northern part, is deeply interconnected to the U.S. This is where you have the manufacturing jobs and so on. Very well integrated, seamless, and now with the relatively open borders that NAFTA has fostered, a lot of trade has expanded. Now that has left other parts of Mexico, especially the south, a lot less, more disadvantaged. There's less investment there and lots more poverty. And indeed, the inequality has heightened. And, adding to that, Mexico facing some real social and political challenges, especially the result of this, drug wars that are here and the drug cartels. Also, again, I like to remind people, we see it as if it's Mexico's problem. And Mexico certainly is bearing the brunt of it, the violence that's associated with that, the corruption. But, the reality is that there would not be a drug issue in Mexico if there was not a voracious appetite in the U.S. and in Europe for narcotics, for drugs. I mean, the market for those goods is in the north. Mm-hmm. And so we help to foster that. Moreover, all the weapons, and they're pretty intense, the weapons that these drug cartels have, where do they come from? They don't come from Mexico, they come from the U.S. And so we are part of this whole drug issue, and yet we tend to look at it as if it's only Mexico's problem and that they have to take care of it. It's not something that they can solve themselves. It is part of our own. So again, challenges, no doubt, corruption, inefficiency there, and it has gotten better than maybe 20, 30, 50 years ago, but it still is a challenge, especially for, many new players. But companies have always been here, always will be here. There's a lot of investment into Mexico. Who it benefits, those are different questions, because it has concentrated a lot of wealth, and NAFTA has been good for Mexico, but it's been especially good for the very wealthy billionaires it's created over the years. And the richest man in the world, his first name, Carlos Hank Slim.
You must be related, eh?
Yeah, I wish. I don't have any of his wealth, but he is, sort of one of the leading industrialists here. And now these very wealthy Mexicans are investing in the U.S. And so our economy depends on them for, the two-way trade.
See how the tide turns.
Oh, yes.
Let's take another break, Carlos. It's Carlos Juarez, global traveler. And we're catching up with Carlos today on Global Connection. And we have miles to go. We'll be right back after this short break.
Ah, excellent.
Aloha, my name is Senator from the Island, an ER physician. Every other Tuesday, I get to host a show here on the ThinkTech program about healthcare. We call it Healthcare in Hawaii. It's really enjoyable for me to bring other healthcare leaders from around the state to talk about our pressing issues. Hawaii has long been the health state, but we need to keep up the momentum, the inertia, and with your help and with your participation, we can come and share all of the big issues that are pressing day to day. Thanks for joining us every Tuesday, alternating weeks from 2 to 2:45.
Aloha, my name is PJ and I'm the host of Hawaii Sports Update. I am very interested in local sports and that's why I host the Hawaii Sports Update show. I bring in guests from Hawaii, I bring in guests from UH, I bring in guests from the community, I bring in big names, I bring in small names, I bring in all names that are community related and doing positive things, sports related in the community. Come join me every Tuesday at 1 p.m. here on Hawaii Sports Update. You can also join me on my golf tournament, the first annual PJ Sports Radio Show Golf Tournament. It's going to be held at Coral Creek. For any information, go to ThinkTech Hawaii, INC, and friend us. The PayPal and a summary of the event will be right there available for you. And don't forget to tweet us.
Okay, we're back with Carlos Juarez, a global traveler, talking about catching up with him. During the break, Carlos, we were talking about this regrettable incident where a journalist who was writing against the cartel in Veracruz had threats made against him, so he left Veracruz to come to where he thought he'd be safe as a journalist. Customarily, journalists are safe in Mexico City, but they came down and assassinated him in Mexico City. It was within the last few days.
That's right.
And I guess the question I put there, two questions coming out of that. You know, the first thing is, I mean, is this, it's always a threat when you lose First Amendment. You know, it's always a threat when journalists can't speak out and they are attacked for what they say. Does the Mexican people, does the Mexican government treat this as serious? Can anything be done? Will the pendulum swing the other way on this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a shock to the establishment here, both the government and just the population. And this incident that you mentioned just a couple of days ago really just, further, underscores that. A journalist comes here thinking he's safe, gets assassinated in the home. It's a challenge. On the other hand, I guess I want to say this, that, Mexico has really been undergoing a democratization process, an opening of its political system in the last 20, 25 years. It's not fully open and democratic, but it's certainly much more than it was, in the past. And today, one area is precisely in journalism. You have a lot more independent journalists, and you have a lot more freedom of journalism. Of course, that means more danger because they're touching on subjects that, when you're covering the drug cartel, this is dangerous business. But in the past, Mexico had a media that was entirely controlled by the government, and you basically only got the news that was approved by the officials. Today, there's a lot more independent journalism, a lot more investigative journalism, dangerous business, of course. Mexico is suffering a lot of this. The drug trafficking that goes on here, most of the violence tends to be targeted between these cartels fighting each other. But part of it is also taking on anybody like a journalist who is, trying to tell the story or reveal, some details. So it's got to be one of the most dangerous jobs, and Mexico has faced over the years many journalists who've been killed. A country that I would parallel it to and maybe offer a contrast, Colombia in South America went through a period of tremendous violence, especially in the 80s and into the early 90s. Similarly, journalists were targets, judges. Today, you fast forward, and it's not that the country has eliminated it, but it has certainly brought it down to levels that are not what it used to be. And Colombia today is a bit more safer than ever. Journalism is vibrant and very much alive and well. Sadly, Mexico has, even the term has been used, Colombianization. A lot of the negative parts of this drug, economy are now very much part of Mexico's day-to-day life. And for those who don't know Mexico well, I would tell you, this is not the Mexico of 25, 30 years back. I mean, this is a place you could travel anywhere without any fear. Today, you need to be careful. You need to know, especially in some provincial areas, that you have to be careful not to be in the wrong place. So that's a sad part of it. And yet, again, having said that, I will say, most people lead normal lives, and they're not just, you don't see just random killings going on everywhere. It's very targeted often when it comes to these drug cartels. They're killing, they're basically those that are challenging their turf control, or they're killing, authorities or journalists. So
somehow this is connected, maybe indirectly, to one thread of our discussion today, and that is the fact that people in Mexico are interested in what the journalists have to say. They have better education, perhaps, than they used to. They are more interested in taking education elsewhere. For example, coming to Hawaii for HBU education. What are your comments? What are your thoughts about the educational system in Mexico these days? How it's changed, and the interest of the individual student to take education elsewhere?
Yeah, well, it's a big thing. I mean, the public system here, I mean, it does remain challenging, just as a country that has, difficulty, dealing with public, let's say, public goods. And the other thing is that actually, many of the schools and maybe students in particular, once you get to the high school level and especially university, in the public system, very politicized. That's a long tradition here. A lot of political activism, and partly because these are, the future leaders of the country, and they're looking and saying, wait a minute, there's injustice here, and there's a lot of, things that they want to call attention to. And we were speaking about, the journalism and the media, and today social media is such a powerful force here, so that you have groups of young students and student leaders that are using public, social media to mobilize opinion. Mexico, of course, this past year, in the news, was a very tragic incident when a group of about 43 young student, teacher trainers from the state of Guerrero here south of Mexico City were apparently taken out and disappeared and killed. And the end result was that it was the complicity of the local mayor, and this has been a real scandal for the Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto, how he has not been able to handle that situation well. But back to the other, I would say, Mexico has a pretty sizable middle class, and certainly, upper middle class, more educated, and these are people who today, like many parts of the world, they're more globally oriented. They want to have better education skills, language, English, etc. So there is certainly a growing trend of more Mexicans coming to study abroad. The U.S., the most obvious, natural place. We don't have huge numbers in Hawaii, but we do have some who trickle there. But it's not easy for most. They don't have a lot of scholarship funding for, let's say, more modest income families. But those who are wealthier do find opportunities to send their kids abroad. And I would tell you the elites here, anybody who's like a highest level government official, it's almost like expected that you have to have a degree from Harvard or Yale. And so those elite schools certainly recruit quite a bit of the elites from Mexico and other parts of the world, Latin America. So, the education is always an interesting connection. There's a movement that goes on there. In terms of here in Mexico, a little harder for me to say. I haven't, really focused on understanding the issues too much. But what I do know, some of the university systems here, increasingly they are more internationally oriented and, English language programs. I myself was a Fulbright scholar here in the year 2000 in Mexico, in another city, San Luis Potosí. And at that time, I remember coming here, I was excited that I might be able to teach in Spanish and use, my heritage language. They wanted English because they need their students to be better skilled at language, English language.
Is that the case today, Carlos? People in Mexico generally speak English?
I would say, the middle class, more educated, anybody who is under 50 or 60, yes, have a working knowledge of English. And some of it, it's interesting, has to do with the popular culture. You watch a lot of movies or television and, you get exposed to the language and just greater globalization that there is, I think fair to say, a pretty good working knowledge. And then anybody who's a professional, if, even if you're an artist or, engineer or banker, you're dealing, with people across borders, and English is the lingua franca that you need to know. So it is certainly more widespread than ever, more among the middle and, upper classes, of course, among the maybe more popular and, poorer, you wouldn't see that, no.
I think sometimes we forget that as America, as the U.S. becomes globalized, and other places become globalized too.
Yes,
just
absolutely.
as we make progress in reaching out, then other places like Mexico. and
Yes.
Mexico's moving. And furthermore, it seems to me from this discussion that the level of interdependence we have with Mexico is much greater than it was at every level. We are
Absolutely.
bonded at the hip right now, whether Donald Trump agrees or not.
No. And you know, since we've got a lot of listeners perhaps in Hawaii, I mean, people in Hawaii don't quite realize that Mexico, or I should say Mexicans, have had a long history in Hawaii. We tend to be under the radar in small numbers, particularly, you know, from other immigrant groups. But it was King Kamehameha III who brought the first Mexicans. They came from California, but they were Mexicans, and they were the ranchers who helped to develop the cattle industry on the Big Island. And so that was the first wave, a very small number. More recently, like others, I mean, you've got many who are Mexican Americans, myself and others that come through the military, for example. But there's a very small community of Mexicans in Hawaii, but they get sort of hidden under the radar with all the Filipinos and even the Puerto Rican diaspora that we have from a prior immigration. But they've always been there. They keep coming, and my guess. Actually, about a year ago, Aeromexico, one of the major airlines here, is in talking with Hawaii tourism authorities, is looking at the potential of a direct flight from Mexico City to Honolulu, and that will certainly begin to change opportunities for tourism and even investment as more Mexicans can go directly. You know, some of them do, but having to make a stopover in LA or San Francisco, sometimes it's much easier just to fly directly to Vancouver and go ski in Whistler rather than
That's a great thing. Before you leave Mexico City, you should make a couple of calls and see if you can get that started.
Yes.
Are you coming back now, Carlos?
Pretty soon, yeah, in the next week or two. Now, a last little factoid. I didn't learn this until a couple years ago, but the closest foreign capital city to Honolulu, it's not Tokyo, it's not Seoul, it's Mexico City. If you look at a geographic distance, Hawaii and Mexico City are pretty closely parallel. Mexico City is closer than Tokyo, and that's an interesting, just little factoid.
Well, thank you, Carlos. We're out of time, but I really have enjoyed this discussion. I hope I get to talk with you again soon. I hope you're coming back soon, and we can resume in the studio. Carlos Juarez, a global traveler, catching up with him today in Mexico City by Skype here on Global Connections. Thank you so much, and may I say, adios.
Adios.
Thank you, Carlos.